Hi everyone. Before I get to the main video, I just want to touch on a sad and shocking story that's emerged here in the UK, which is the mass shooting in Plymouth, Devon. I won't say too much about this because it's still a developing story insofar as the details. Um, but it's our first mass shooting really in 11 years since Cumbria shootings of 2010. So it's a surprising sort of story for this country because it's such a rare event. But I just think that with something like this, it's important that people don't jump to conclusions about maybe the motivations of the gunman or anything like that. I've heard, for example, speculation that he had visited so-called incel sites. That might be true, but half his victims were male, so um, people need to be careful not to jump to conclusions about this. But six dead, two injured. It is our worst mass shooting since Cumbria. Incidentally, I notice some Americans and some people who think that more guns would be the answer to this. The fact remains, it's an extremely rare event in this country. Um, Apparently, Devon and Cornwall police, this guy had a firearm. It had been taken away, and then he got it again after his suspension had passed. So that's going to need to be investigated. But um, I don't think anyone should be coming in and saying, "Oh, well, this proves the British need to change the gun laws." I think our gun laws are, for the most part, very effective. That's why this sort of event is so mercifully rare. I mean, this would just be another week in the United States. So really, that's something to consider. Now, to get into the main video, because I didn't think I was going to make a specific video on that. So, Afghanistan. This is a very difficult situation, and it's very depressing to see what's happening there right now. Um, a number of my subscribers have asked about me commenting on this issue. So it's necessary to look a bit at the history of this. Afghanistan really has been in conflict, basically intermittently, for 41 years. I mean, if you look at the Tsar Revolution of 1977, 78, 42 years in fact, then the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which was a massive, massive disaster. Then, of course, came the Olympic boycott in Moscow with the Carter administration ordering that. But that Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, what you had was two starkly opposing ideologies. You had the Soviets on one hand and a very conservative Islamic country on the other, so Soviet communism and Islamic theocracy. Then you had the anarchy and civil war of the 90s, the rise of the Taliban in 1996 97, and then the US led conflict from 2001, which has included the ongoing Taliban insurgency. Now, in the last couple of days, Herat has fallen, Lashkar has fallen, Kandahar has fallen, and it looks like Kabul is on the brink of falling. I think there's some echoes with this in the fall of Saigon in 1975. And of course, what we saw after the fall of Saigon was the Khmer Rouge and the genocide that came with that. I'm not suggesting the same thing's going to happen, but it's hard to not see this as a very grim future for Afghanistan. So, with that sort of analysis, some would be very tempted to say, "Oh well, the last 20 years was a waste of time, and the West should never have got involved." I tend to reject this sort of worldview because I think it very, very much underestimates the nature of jihadism. Um, it's very important to understand that the US went into Afghan in the first place because the Taliban were providing safe haven for Al Qaeda. I forget the specific term that's used, but this is no small thing. They felt honor bound to defend Al Qaeda to provide them with safe haven. That was a direct statement of hostility to the United States after it suffered its not only its most devastating terrorist attack, but the most devastating terrorist attack in modern history. The world will forever remember those images. So I think it's very, very important to remember that context. And that's why I get quite frustrated when people just list off these random Middle East and South Asian countries as if it's all one and the same. Incidentally, I say South Asian because Afghanistan isn't really the Middle East, it's more South Asia. But people just say, oh, the West is always getting involved in these wars. Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Libya. They just sort of naming them off like a list, like they're all the same thing. But they're not. All those conflicts have different contexts and different backgrounds. I happen to think that intervention in Afghanistan was justified. Um, in Syria, the war began when Bashar Assad used brute force against legitimate protests. It wasn't a war that the West began. Um, with Afghanistan and Iraq, those conflicts did begin, at least the American stage of the Afghan war, we should say, with American intervention. Iraq was a massive disaster because it was based on the premise of weapons of mass destruction that weren't there, and you had hawks like the late Donald Rumsfeld were pushing that. But with Afghanistan, I do think it's different because in the case of Iraq, you had this false premise of weapons of mass destruction. With Afghanistan, there was no false premise. The Taliban was a brutal theocratic regime, and they had provided safe haven to Al Qaeda. So that's not. That's why I think it's just lazy to lump Afghanistan and Iraq together. Of course, the Bush administration saw it as part of the broader axis of evil agenda, and it was a massive, massive foreign policy disaster, really, to go into Iraq without planning for post-war building. But focus on Afghanistan. It's also conveniently forgotten that at that time in 2001, a large swathe of the UN, that is, most countries, supported some sort of intervention. This again differs from Iraq, where there's a very sharp divide. Even China and Russia were muted in their criticism of intervention at that time. Um, so I think that those who condemn America and condemn Britain and condemn NATO, they need to really ask themselves, what would their alternative have been? You had a vicious, theocratic regime in power that had provided safe haven to the terrorist organization responsible for the worst terrorist attack on American soil. Could anyone really, reasonably, have expected the Bush administration to have done nothing? I've just said, oh well, they're horrible people, but we shouldn't go in because war's a bad thing. I don't think that's realistic. I also feel that there is a particular school of thought. I'm thinking of groups like the Stop the War Coalition and others whose whole worldview is to condemn the West first. Um, but I think that portrays those brave Afghans who have fought against the Taliban. I think it portrays the courage of Afghan women. And the fact of the matter is, after Western intervention, whilst it was a war, people died. The fact of the matter is, Afghan women could stand in parliament, Afghan girls could go to school. It remained a desperately poor country. It remained a major conflict, still is. But I think to say that it was all in vain, I agree with the Prime Minister. I think that's wrong because it disregards advantages that were reached. Of course, the big danger now is all of that's going to be reversed with the Taliban advance. And I do think this might go down as a massive blunder by the Biden administration. I understand the logic of it, namely that this seemed to be a never ending war 20 years, trillions of dollars, thousands of lives. I mean, we had 457 British personnel died in relation to the Afghan conflict, and it was over 2,000 Americans, hundreds of Canadians, Germans. This was truly a very costly conflict. And Afghans, there's no precise figure, but at least 100,000. So, it's unknown exactly how many Taliban fighters were killed. But the danger here is this might be 20 years of anger and resentment built up, and this is the Taliban's revenge. Now, what's chilling is the threats. They're not saying we're going to get into power and we'll compromise, we will get into some sort of power sharing agreement. They're saying we're going to kill those who are too Western. This must be a terrifying time for a lot of Afghans. And I think at the very least, what we should do is take away red tape, speed up or take away bureaucracy, help Afghan interpreters and their families, if need be, to settle in this country. Because those people have, risked their lives to protect British troops and to help build that country. So at the very least, I think we need to give them safe haven. We're a great country and we can do it. But if we just Boris Johnson said we're not going to abandon the Afghans, Joe Biden said that, but from an Afghan perspective, they might look at that's exactly what's happening. Now, I do think there's questions, namely that, we've been training Afghan troops for years. Why have the Taliban got this far? I mean, why hasn't the Afghan army been sufficiently able to repeal them? And that gets into issues about foreign fighters in the Taliban. They're not all Afghans. So as I understand it, there's Uzbeks, there's Tajiks among the Taliban fighters, probably others. Um, so I think destroying the propaganda would have been, I mean, it's fine now to look at retrospect, but it seems that Kabul is now on the brink. And it's just a very sad, grim situation. But I do get frustrated with this idea that the West just not went in, everything would be fine. Here's what probably would have happened. The Taliban would have stayed in power, but you probably would have had a return to civil war in some form, because you would have had insurgency movements against the Taliban. As we've seen over the last 20 years, it's the Taliban is insurgency, but in the case of the Taliban staying in power, you would have had insurgency movements against the Taliban. Some sort of civil war would have resumed anyway. The truth is, Afghanistan is a very, very troubled land, and I think its problems are. I mean, it's known as the graveyard of empires. Um, I have absolutely no doubt that fundamentalist Islam is almost certainly the primary cause of Afghanistan's problems. Certainly, the Soviet invasion inflamed the situation. It was known as the Soviets' Vietnam. But ultimately, I do think fundamentalist Islam, and it's the same in Pakistan. Not quite the same situation because obviously Pakistan's a much bigger country, but in terms of population. But wherever you have fundamentalist Islam, you're not going to get progress. So at this point, I think the best thing we can do is speed up the process, take away the red tape, help those interpreters. I understand British troops are going in to help the evacuation. It really is like the fall of Saigon. It's a very, very dramatic development. Um, I don't know what's going to happen now. Will the country have some sort of peace? But then the question is, what is peace under a tyranny? Is it really, let's say you have a case where the Taliban takes over the country and maybe they get some sort of stability, but at what price? All the rights that women have gained will be lost. Men who don't grow beards will be persecuted. Minorities will be persecuted. But I just think that those who want to dismiss Western involvement, I think there's valid criticism of the West. I do think that, firstly, I don't know if the Biden administration should have announced a date of withdrawal. Because what does that do? It tells the Taliban what the plan is. Maybe that should have been top secret. And, only divulging the information to Afghan allies, Afghan partners. But to announce it the way the Biden administration done, it gave the Taliban advance notice. Therefore, it galvanized them. There is an argument that ultimately it is their country. It is the responsibility of the Afghans in that sense. But for interpreters and other Afghans who risk their lives for Western troops, it will feel like a betrayal. But, you know, 457 British troops lost their lives, probably contractors and journalists as well. It's very hard to know because I think if the US stayed, I mean, we can train and train and train the Afghan forces, but I think there's a lot of factors there: pay, numbers, and crushing the jihadist propaganda, because that's no doubt they're getting recruits, like I say, from other Central Asian countries and likely beyond. I know the Taliban and ISIS don't see eye to eye, but if they had some sort of ceasefire and they joined forces, that would be a very terrifying prospect. This idea that if the West never intervened, it would be fine. I mean, look at the state of the aims of ISIS, and I know that's ISIS and not the Taliban, but the nature of Islamic Jihad is not about we just want to kick the foreign infidels out. We want to spread the caliphate. They don't want to just be restricted to that. Certainly not ISIS. And I mean, the Taliban might be restricted to Afghanistan and Pakistan, but the nature of Islamic jihadism is not, though, let's just throw the foreigners out and we'll all live in peace. It's let's throw the foreigners out, let's subjugate people, and let's spread the caliphate violently. You can't compromise with that mindset. So I do think maybe historically this will go down as a massive mistake, and Biden's standing to it, standing with it. The thing is, there's no hope that the Taliban will moderate and they'll sort of say, well, we'll have some sort of power sharing and we promise we won't do this and that, because they have promised the exact opposite. That's why it's such a grim and sad situation. I do think there's going to be a humanitarian crisis. There's going to be a mass exodus of that country, and we need to help as much as we can. There's legitimate issues around immigration, but this is one area where I don't think anyone can say with a straight face that we don't have a moral obligation to help Afghan refugees, especially those who have helped us, helped protect our troops. Anyway, I'll leave it there, but obviously this is something that's going to develop. I think the next story will be the fall of Kabul. And then it's just like history. We're in the third decade of the 21st century, but the Taliban ban music, they ban dancing. They're just a barbaric, vicious bunch of Islamist thugs. And they have a mindset that I think is alien to any reasonable person. It's just, I don't know how you can compromise with that sort of mindset. I mean, we could say let's just kill them all, but you have a never-ending supply of recruits. There is one other thing I'll just add, which is the Chinese interest. And that's interesting because, they, of course, they're probably gloating about this, oh, look at America's failure. But China's sending out mixed messages. On one hand, they're persecuting the Uyghurs, as they put it. Of course, they don't say it's persecution, but as they put it, we need to do this to stop Islamic fundamentalism. Yet they've spoken to senior Taliban representatives, I believe in Beijing and elsewhere. So what's China's game? Maybe let the Chinese try and handle this and then see if they can do any better. The Soviets failed. I don't think NATO failed necessarily, but we certainly didn't succeed. So let the Chinese have a go. I mean, really, it should be that the Afghans have a go. It's their country. But this is a desperately poor country, and the Taliban is more powerful, seems to be more galvanized than the Afghan forces. So, what's China's game? I don't know. Perhaps trying to get an Islamist bulwark against any sort of domestic jihad. I mean, like I say, the Taliban and ISIS are not exactly friends, so perhaps the Chinese see it useful having the Taliban on their side. or rather using the Taliban in that way. It's very hypocritical, since they're cracking down on Islamic fundamentalism supposedly. But I think that it's difficult to see any optimism for that country, and it's such a tragedy. Afghanistan has a rich culture. At least it did until 1977, 78. And this is why Islamic fundamentalism is such a plague on this world. Afghanistan is an example of it. But I just think that those who want to blame all the shortcomings in the West are being so short sighted. And they don't have any alternative. They're very good at throwing stones and pointing fingers, but they don't actually have any answer. And they'll say, organizations that can stop the war coalition will say, "Oh, we're not supporting the Taliban," but by just criticizing the West, they're not providing answers. What's their message to Afghan women, Afghan girls, Afghan moderates? What's their message for them? Anyway, no doubt there'll be more to say on this subject. I'll leave it there for now. Um, Let me know your thoughts, and please do consider the things I've said because I think this is not something that can be just dismissed in a sweeping, precise way because there's no easy answers when it comes to Afghanistan. Thanks for watching.